Rogue, Great Dark Beyond. First card we're looking at is Pressure Points, a 3 mana shadow spell. It reads, deal 3 damage to a minion, reduce the cost of combo cards in your hand by 1. So, combo cards inherently, you want to be playing as many of them in a single turn as you possibly can in order to trigger as many combo effects as you can. Eviscerate has been around since the game's introduction. Really good spell for getting your opponent killed as quickly as possible. And then more recent additions, we've seen O Manager, which does see a decent amount of play and feeds into the other current rogue archetype, which focuses around the coin. So being able to trigger this more reliably is also good. Cards which we haven't really seen are things like One Hit Wonder, which is essentially a removal spell where, as long as you haven't cast this as your first card, you are basically going to kill whatever this hits into, as long as it doesn't have Divine Shield. And then other cards such as Disc Jockey, which keeps a combo chain going for as long as possible. Disc Jockey in particular does not have a good stat line though. 1 health is very easily removed, so it's not a good card to be introducing alongside other combo cards, even if it does encourage this big chain. Disc Jockey can find other disc jockeys, which doesn't really advance that game plan very well. Deafen, which is more of a controlling tool, specifically because it can only target a minion. This really feels like a spell which is something Priest is more interested in than Rogue. Tentacle Grip, which feeds into the Chaotic Tendril idea, which hasn't really been a thing in a while. The 10 mana spell pool, when this was introduced, was a lot more enticing. In particular, there were warrior builds which wanted to advance to casting the 10 mana spell as quickly as possible. I don't think that's going to be particularly enticing. Bargain Bin Buccaneer is a decent tempo tool, getting 2/3/2s with Rush. It's quite strong. And yeah, I could talk about all these cards individually, but combo is essentially this sort of tempo tool which continues to see a drip feed of support through basically every set, but never it's not had a particularly strong light shined on it in quite some time. And because of that, none of these cards in particular see a great deal of play. Dubious Purchase, I think, does, but I think you're as much interested in the card draw effect than you are the combo effect of destroying a random enemy minion. So there's just not really anything in Rogue currently where, other than the old reliable of Eviscerate, it's not particularly the combo part of the card that you're absolutely hell-bent on guaranteeing you get. And for that reason, Pressure Points, dealing 3 damage to a minion, is, a dependable removal in that early stage of the game. But it is tacked onto a 3 mana cost, which does make this, less appealing than other options, which are 2 mana or less. With the added bonus of the combo card reduction, it's just not particularly appealing. So whilst this is certainly one to keep your eye on going forward, as Rogue will continue to get combo cards in every set, I would imagine, I don't think it currently has much of a place in any Rogue deck currently, unless we see a significant number of cards in the set which do influence combo. And here we have Eridar Skulker, a 2 mana 1/3 demon. Combo and spell burst, gain 2 attack and stealth. So this is a combo card, and I'd say it's a fairly strong one. If you have to tempo this out as a 2 mana 1/3, that's not very good. Rogue, out of everyone, does have the largest depth in terms of 0 mana cards historically, and tools such as preparation, which help make other spells cost 0 as well. So in particular, Rogue is going to have quite an easy time triggering spell burst. So if you were to be casting Eridar Skulker on turn 2 alongside something like Backstab, you are reliably triggering a 3/3 with stealth. Backstab has not seen any significant play in a long time though. The caveat of it being an undamaged minion and only 2 damage means that this has fallen off in... It's not really seen play in quite a few years actually, as much as it was a strong addition in Hearthstone's infancy. The added bonus here, where if you can combo out Eridar Skulker and have the 3/3 with stealth, attack with it, and then on the same turn cast a spell, which then regains stealth and gives it another +2 attack, so potentially a 5/3, which your opponent still can't target. That could prove to be quite an annoyance. But I think this card does stand strong on its own, outside of requiring a combo package to support it. So it's whether this card is good enough, and I think it is one that is quite flexible in that it can just be slotted into rogue decks of basically any archetype. Rogue, in terms of 2-drops at the moment, has Kajamite Creation. If you are particularly interested in the Thief package, which is one of Rogue's stronger identities at the moment, aside from, removal spells to prevent your opponent, Toy Boat hasn't actually seen any real play, and neither has the Pirate package at large for Rogue. But you might also be looking at things like coining out the Bargain Bin Buccaneer to get 2 3/2s with Rush, as opposed to setting up an Eridar Skulker. So, yeah. Or something like Bounty Wrangler, coining this out to get 3/4 and another coin. I think there is room for Rogue to have a new 2 mana minion, and this one, in some kind of aggro burst package where your opponent just can't interact with it, does make this quite appealing. I've spoken quite a bit about 3 health minions and how easy they are to remove, so to have something which is really difficult to hit with target removal at the start of the game, I think this means that this has a decent potential of seeing play. Our next card is Quasar, a 6 mana spell. It shuffles your hand into your deck, and it reduces the cost of cards in your deck by 3. One clear comparison is Astral Communion from Druid, all the way back in the Grand Tournament. This was another ambitious option, except for Druid it was to immediately ramp to 10 mana with the caveat of emptying your hand, which Quasar also does. It's just quite hard to deliberately set up a situation where emptying your hand completely to improve your deck for the rest of the game is really hard to recover from the tempo loss, having to spend 6 mana. Admittedly, Rogue can do something like cast Preparation in order to make it cheaper, but that's still quite the commitment to this effect. The standout combo potential here is with Knick-Knack Shack, So on a prior turn, you've played Knick Knack Shack, and after you've cast Quasar on the subsequent turn, you then use your Knick Knack Shack to draw a card, which has been reduced by 3. Play that card, which then reopens Knick Knack Shack, and repeat the process as much as you can possibly get away with. The hard part is, how do you put that deck together to specifically benefit a rogue? Rogue doesn't necessarily care about putting together a really impressive board state. It generally wants to sneak damage through with spells like Eviscerate over the top. Just generally doesn't excel at board based combat directly. So I'm just having the hardest time understanding which specific cards you might want to abuse. Triple sevens is the other one, so less so for the 7 damage to a minion, but drawing 7 cards to bounce back after the Quasar, that also seems like an enticing proposition, particularly just because triple sevens has seen 0 play since its introduction, so having an actual option for it would be great. Ideally, you would be drawing this off of your Quasar and having it reduced to 4 mana, and then all those cards as well having the reduction. So perhaps it is a case where it's this more mid-rangey style of, well, higher cost at the very least. But because Rogue has never really been that interested in cards where they're fighting for the board, are you doing some weird behavior with AFK by bringing all your minions in the same turn and then buffing them all? Yeah, really open-ended design, really interesting, and really hard to imagine what people are going to come up with. But it's going to be really fun for people to try and make that card work, and definitely one that needs to be kept an eye on going into the future. It is also quite reminiscent of something like Wheel of Death, where if Quasar is good, it's going to feel really oppressive and may unfortunately have that bad connotation where the devs feel the need to step in and nuke the card when its only crime was doing the thing that it promised to do, which Wheel of Death has fallen foul of. I hope it finds a more happy medium than people's feelings towards Wheel of Death, but we shall just have to wait and see. Have fun with it. Talgath, 4 mana 4/4 demon, legendary, undamaged enemy minions take double damage, and combo get a backstab. So, the card in of itself, presuming you can get it to combo, you play a 4 mana 4/4 with an irrelevant minion type for rogue, and you get a spell which essentially will deal 4 damage to an undamaged minion. So this will kill 1 minion. It's a 1-for-1 card. That is nowhere near good enough to be taking up a slot in your deck. In terms of Rogue's options for damage spells, Tarslick has a very similar effect. Stacking these together, I believe, will quadruple the damage, but that is specifically to enemy minions as opposed to trying to deal a lot of damage to your opponent. So that doesn't really mesh with the type of game plan that rogues are traditionally interested in. Getting to deal 8 damage, it essentially turns a lot of your damage cards into hard removal. Something like Fan of Knives becomes a 2 damage AoE. But again, this is only when those minions are undamaged. So if you cannot immediately remove these threats with something like Fan of Knives, and you were to try and cast a second copy of Fan of Knives, for example, that will then only deal 1 damage to all enemy minions again. So the effect in of itself just does not seem strong at all, and does not mesh with what Rogue traditionally wants to be doing either, and I think it means that Talgath just sees no play. Barrel Roll, 3 mana, deal 5 damage to an undamaged character, costs 1 if you're building a starship. We care about the starship in Rogue, but we haven't seen any other starship cards yet. Dealing 3 damage to an undamaged character and having that cost 1, that is quite strong removal. I think I need to talk about Barrel Roll after I've spoken about other cards first, though. Space Rock Collector, 1 mana 2/1, Battle Cry. Your next combo card costs 1 less. So here is another card which is encouraging you to run combo cards and reduce the cost of said cards. And our most expensive combo card, unless I'm missing any in my collection, no, is a 4 mana Elven Minstrel. So these effects are really trying to encourage some kind of disc jockey type string of combo cards which are trying to overwhelm your opponent. I just don't think the current Rogue selection of combo cards achieves that goal. This is still a really strong 1 mana card though, and could be run in its own right. Turn 1, Space Rock Collector into something like the Bargain Bin Buccaneer on turn 2 is a really imposing tempo into whatever else your opponent might do in. That does compete really strongly with the other aggressive packages, so something like aggro hand buff paladin. So I think that does set this up really nicely. But in terms of creating new deck archetypes for Rogue, no, not yet, at least. We will need to see more combo cards. Lucky Comet, a 2 mana spell. Discover a combo minion. The next one you play triggers its combo twice. So that's currently 8 combo minions in Rogue. I think there's a above 50% chance you would see any specific one. It's just that, once again, how many of these combo effects are you particularly interested in? SI7 Agent, as strong as it once was, is nowhere near where it once was. And getting to trigger that twice to deal 4 damage to an enemy minion, okay, is not bad, but it's not the type of effect that's going to win games. It's just going to help you keep up with what other more powerful strategies are doing to you. Getting to draw 4 minions from your deck, potentially more interesting. Getting 2 coins, that's pretty whatever. Beatboxer dealing 8 damage randomly among all enemies. Yeah, it's okay. A 3rd copy of Bargain Bin Buccaneer. I quite like that. But again, Bargain Bin Buccaneer is doing so much of the heavy lifting here to try and make these combo cards seem reasonable, and it can't do it all on its own. And right now, that's what it seems to be having to try and do. So, again, we need to see better combo support in the future before Lucky Comet becomes a viable option. Scrounging Shipwright, a 2 mana 3/2 Draenei. Death Rattle, gain a random starship piece from another class. So, Rogue, in terms of starships, does not have its own starship pieces. It only takes them from other classes. So, if you are going into the starship piece archetype for Rogue, it does coincide with the Thief package. So, you want to be trying to run cards which can also reliably find the other starship pieces if you want to make your starship particularly imposing. It's hard to say how good randomly putting together the other starship pieces from other classes are, because obviously none of us have actually played with any of them yet. The starship cards are much more cohesive when they are within their own classes. If you're randomly pulling them together, how reliably can you make that work? It may just be a case of pulling together what you can as quickly as possible, pressing the 5 mana button to get your starship, and then that just be a huge minion and leaving your opponents to deal with it. It is also worth saying that the rogue can, of course, play the 2 neutral starship options, which are the 3 mana 3/2 Divine Shield and the 4 mana 3/4 Taunt, which has Death Rattle to gain 6 armor. Neither of which are strong enough to be putting a starship together on their own. So, again, it's just reliant on how many of the other starship pieces you can pull together as quickly as possible. And a 2 mana 3/2 is an entirely reasonable stat line, so that does set this off. Starship Schematic, 1 mana spell, discover a starship piece from another class. So again, rather than the 2-drop that we've just looked at, this one is discovering the starship piece. It helps synergize whatever starship you're pulling together a lot better. Likely, if you've seen a starship piece from a certain class already, you'll probably be wanting to take more of those. You probably want to play this after you've played the Scrounging Shipwright. A 1 mana spell is always very flexible as well, so it's not too difficult to see this being cast easily. Yeah, it's just more thief rogue, but with a slightly more concentrated direction. I guess I just find it quite lackluster. And I think Rogue's offerings in general this expansion seem really lackluster. The last card we've got now is the Gravitational Displacer, a 5 mana 4/3 legendary starship piece, which when launched summons a copy of the starship. So we're being asked here to play a 5 mana 4/3, which doesn't do anything other than contribute to your starship. And then after this has died and you've already got other starship pieces into play that have also died, when you summon your starship, you will get 2 of them instead of 1 of them. And it's just going to be some weird hodgepodge mishmash of whatever starship pieces you've been able to find. I just have a hard time seeing that being worth trying to do when you only have these 2 cards which actually get you more starship pieces from other classes, a 5 mana 4/3 vanilla minion when you play it, and a couple neutral starship pieces as well. Like, surely all the other starship classes do this better. So, yeah, unfortunately, I am quite skeptical about this set for Rogue as a whole. I do think Quasar seems like a fun time, but that is leaning on just the general card pool rather than anything particularly interesting within the Rogue class itself this expansion. and I think that is a bit of a shame. Eridar Skulker, though, I think has the best potential as just being a sturdy 2-drop for Rogue in the sets going forward, but otherwise, not much for Rogue to pay serious attention to, which, yeah, unfortunate. I suppose there's something to be said here for the Draenei. If your Velen can also pull more starship pieces out, but that's a 7 mana card, and Rogue needs to be playing faster than that, really. So, yeah, I don't believe in Velen saving Rogue, unfortunately. Okay, and now we move on to Shaman. So, Murmur is a 6/6 elemental for 6, which has Battlecry minions cost 1, but immediately die after being played. So, Battlecry minions are very ubiquitous and always will be. So, Murmur has a lot of options for what kind of shenaniganry you can do. With the stipulation of those minions dying after being played, you literally only care about what the battle cry is rather than the minion themselves. If you've set up an elemental on a previous turn and you can cast Kalamos for 1 and pick whichever of your invocations that you want to do, you can get your Scar to get the big battle cry, but that does require quite a bit of setup. But Murmur itself does also count as an elemental. The new card from the mini set, which gives +1/+1 to all other Battlecry minions in your hand, deck, and battlefield. Plenty of directions for it to be pulling in, though, and something we're going to keep in mind as we look at the rest of these Shaman cards, because believe me, this is going to be coming up. So, the other Shaman legendary is a 5 mana 6/4, Farseer no Bundo. Death Rattle, open the Galaxy's Lens. It absorbs the power of the next spell you cast. So the Galaxy's Lens is a location with 2 uses, and Spell Burst absorb the spell's power. So essentially, whatever spell you cast is going to go into the Galaxy's Lens, and you can recast that spell 2 more times with the usual rules on when you're allowed to do that with locations. So ideally, you are going to be putting a big spell into this, so something along the lines of Wish Upon a Star, which is a hand buff, or rather, an everything buff of +2/+3, so that's a really imposing one. Pack the House, a little bit less enticing just because it will overload you every time. You could go for something more controlly as well, like Giant Tumbleweed. It is quite the deterrent if you do have a location on the board which says that it will deal 6 damage to all minions and give you a 6/6. So your opponent's going to find it hard to commit to the board. Once Upon a Time, which, similarly to Pack the House, is a kind of tempo option. Wave of Nostalgia, if you can just keep filling up the board with lots of cheap minions and transform them over and over again. If your opponent does clear 1 wave, then summon the next and replay the Galaxy's Lens to recast another wave. So that seems like another really solid option there. Even something like Frosted Acre, getting multiple pairs of 2/4 elementals, or having the option of Ragnaros whenever you need it. There's a lot of big spells in Shaman which feed really well into the Galaxy's Lens, so I do like this card a lot for those types of strategies. Big Spell Shaman has had a lot of support going around it for quite some time and hasn't had the right payoffs yet. We've seen attempts to make the big spell Shaman work with Hagatha the Fabled. It just hasn't quite come together yet, but Farseer Nabundo is another really huge addition to that package and might just be enough to take it over the line. I've really enjoyed Big Spell Shaman in the past when it was more prevalent, and I think it's a really good direction for the class as a whole. Cards like Caress Cabaret Star as well may come into the forefront if the Big Spell Shaman package is really strong. So yeah, I'm a big believer in Farseer Nabundo, and I really hope it does make it over the line. 2 mana spell, Triangulate. Discover a different spell from your deck and shuffle 3 copies of it into your deck. So after you've assessed what kind of deck your opponent's playing, you can quite flexibly decide from the 3 discovers that you get which type of spell you want to be adding more copies of. If you're in a more controlling matchup, you can look at one of your more heavily costed spells and be more greedy and add more copies of that to your deck. Or if you're in a more aggressive matchup and you need something like Aftershocks, having more access to that spell is also really strong. The thing holding back Triangulate is that on the turn that you cast it, it is just 2 mana to do nothing, but I think having a spare 2 mana to get away with casting this isn't completely out of the question, especially if you have just cast something like Aftershocks in a more aggressive game. You've got room to then, rather than playing your hero power or whatever, you can triangulate to stack the deck in whatever manner you see fit. So yeah, again, I think this does point towards a more controlling variant of Shaman, but I think this is a solid option for that deck. 6 mana Shaman spell, Meteor Storm. It's a nature spell as well, and it deals 5 damage to all minions and shuffles 5 asteroids into your deck. So the asteroids are a cast when drawn, deal 2 damage to a random enemy. We are about to see quite a few of these asteroid spells, and this is one of the bigger ones. Crucially, this is just deal 5 damage to all minions. So this does point towards a slightly more controlling deck as opposed to a tempo deck, just because it will deal it to all minions rather than just your opponent. But getting those 5 asteroids into your deck is a really solid start for that strategy as well. Flash of Lightning can help with this quite significantly, both in that it can help make this a tad cheaper, but also in that it does feed into the idea of drawing cards to start getting as many asteroids to come out as possible. Really strong board clear, and we're going to see how good this asteroid package is. Potentially quite a good option for Triangulate as well. Bolide Behemoth, 4 mana 3/6 elemental, battle cry, your asteroids deal 1 more damage this game, and spell burst, shuffle 3 of them into your deck. So on top of the standard 2 damage for asteroids, Bolide Behemoth will push that up to 3, or if you've cast the second copy, 4, or any additional triggers you can get using Shudder Block. Your first copy of Bolide Behemoth would push your meteors up to dealing 5 damage each, which is pretty outrageous. Any asteroid has a decent chance of either killing one of your opponent's minions or just dealing an outrageous amount of damage to your opponent. And then the additional bonus of shuffling 3 of them into your deck off of Spell Burst. If you've already shuffled a decent amount of asteroids into your deck, you don't necessarily get too upset if you don't have the spell on hand. But if you do, things like Lightning Reflexes, Lightning Bolt, Pop-Up Book, these are all reasonable spells to be casting alongside Bolide Behemoth in order to trigger it straight away and get those asteroids shuffled as quickly as possible. There's also a decent chance, if your opponent doesn't have any minions on board, that the bow-eyed Behemoth would survive on turn 4. Having 6 health is quite a high amount for your opponent to deal with, unless they just happen to have something like a Fireball or a Death Strike. So I think there's a decent chance you can get away with playing this on curve and then only activating the spell burst on the next turn. So yeah, I think this is a really strong card for the asteroid deck and elemental decks in general. Next up, Ultraviolet Breaker, a 3 mana 3/2 elemental. Battle Cry, deal 3 damage to an enemy minion and shuffle 3 asteroids into your deck. This is just, even minus the asteroid part, this is a really, really strong card. A 3 mana 3/2 that just is a 3 damage removal. That's exceptional tempo. You know, we were talking earlier about Rogue and how SI7 Agent has dropped off. Well, here's huge power creep. You Battle Cry to deal 3 instead of 2, not combo, and you're getting the asteroids. Like, you've lost 1 health and gained the elemental tribe. This is an all-star card. You're going to see huge amounts of this card in Shaman, and it's pushing this asteroid deck really hard. It's amplifying the elemental deck for Shaman really hard, alongside things like Lamplighter. So much burst damage off the back of even just drawing or getting to the start of your turn and pulling these asteroids out is going to make this really hard to compete with. How good is Shaman's draw right now? Ancestral Knowledge to draw 2. You've got the Cactus Cutter, which specifically draws a spell. Flash of Lightning fits that idea really well. And yeah, say hello to your new nemesis. It is the Ultraviolet Breaker. Huge addition for Shaman here. A little bit too pushed, if anything, to be honest. Next up, a 1 mana spell, First Contact. Summon 2 random 1-cost minions, overload 1. This is a really good spell. So as a baseline, First Contact is essentially like casting Living Roots and choosing to summon the 2 1/1 saplings. This does have overload 1, but whenever you've cast Living Roots as a druid and summoned the 2 1/1s on turn 1, you're very happy. This does also encourage the Wave of Nostalgia Shaman decks quite heavily as well. Running this alongside Pop-Up Book, very similar effect. Pop-Up Book does have the added removal, but First Contact has the potential to summon some really strong 1-cost minions. Things like Miracle Salesman spring to mind as high rolls for this, and I think you're going to see a Miracle Salesman or something similarly strong irritatingly often if you are going against Shaman. The caveat of the overload is not to be overlooked. That is significant. If in particular you are trying to be a more proactive, aggressive deck, having only the 1 mana on your second turn is somewhat crippling, but in those aggressive decks, if you're playing things like the Shock Hopper and the Pop-Up Book, or perhaps you then cast your second First Contact, as long as you can rid yourself of this overload before turn 5, when I imagine you are going to be casting Wave of Nostalgia, you're perfectly happy with whatever you get out of First Contact. So, yeah, I think that does push this deck quite significantly, and Wave of Nostalgia was already seeing some level of play, so I think this is a really good addition to that strategy. Is it a good enough card outside of the Wave of Nostalgia deck? I think it is. In terms of establishing yourself with the board at the start of the game, I think you can afford to just take a turn off if you don't have other 1 mana spells. I still think this competes decently with something like Mining Casualties. If you've cast First Contact and gotten 2/1/1s and your opposing Death Knight player or Paladin player plays Mining Casualties and you can trade both of your 1/1s into their Silverhand recruits, yes, you will take the 2 frail ghouls to the face, but then that is the Mining Casualties dealt with. So yes, I do think First Contact is a strong addition to most Shaman decks. Next up, we've got a 7 mana 5/5 Cosmonaut. It is a Draenei, and its battle cry discovers a spell from your deck and reduces its cost by 5. So another card here which supports a big Shaman spell deck. Again, things like Wish Upon a Star and Packing the House. So lots of good options. Not only is it reducing the cost of said spell, but it discovers it, so you do just then draw it. So that does set up some really strong subsequent turns. Being able to fish out something like Wish Upon a Star earlier on in the game so that you can have it impact as quickly as possible. Really powerful. The only thing that you have to do is to get to 7 mana and play a 5/5. If you can copy this with Velen, that's pretty outrageous. You can be potentially tutoring this out if you do not have that many Draenei in your deck with Troubled Mechanic. 9 mana arcane spell Nebula. Discover 2 8-cost minions to summon with Taunt and Elusive. So 2 8-cost minions, and you get to discover them as well. Does Shaman have... Of course it does. Alakir the Windlord. All this on top with Elusive. So 6 damage straight away, and then just a really annoying thing for your opponent to try and get around. Other 8-cost options from the neutral pool. Something like Collargon, really annoying. Any giant is just a really solid body. Any high stats here, you know, even the more vanilla minions, you know, Ragnaros with Taunt and Elusive. Yeah, really good. Really good. And with all these support items now for Shaman, having this as another really good option for what your high cost spells are just means that I think Nebula is going to make the cut. Having a top end where, you know, turn 5, 6, 7, you can get your first copy of Nebula cast, I think is really good and can potentially close a game out on its own right. So, yeah, I think we're going to see plenty of Nebulas out there. And finally, we have Planetary Navigator. A 2 mana 3/2 Draenei. Battlecry, the next Draenei you play costs 2 less, but has Overload 2. We do have some mana ramp for Draenei in Shaman, and I think this points very, very clearly towards Cosmonaut. Getting to cast Cosmonaut on turn 7 instead of turn 5 is a huge difference, and having Overload 2 afterwards is mitigated by the fact that you've just reduced the cost of that spell by 5 anyway, so I think you probably still can get away with casting something like Nebula for 4 mana on turn 6, having had the Overload 2, so I think it does all just feed really strongly together. Other Draenei than Cosmonaut, which you can cheat out with Planetary Navigator, we've got... So, again, Velen, which we've already talked about, which looks like it's going to have a really strong support package for Shaman to make this work. And another really good one as well is the Lunar Trailblazer. So, having this reduced to 3 mana and then setting the cost of a random spell in your hand to 3 again really promotes this big spell shaman package where they get to cheat out these big spells for a ridiculous discount. Really impactful. So yeah, shaman, really nice variety of options here, both in the asteroid package, which by the way all feeds really nicely into murmur, just being able to stack loads of the battle cry effects which are shuffling the asteroids into your deck at once so that you can have as many come out in one go, which is probably the most impactful way to get asteroids out. And all the big spell stuff alongside the other legendary, I just think means that Shaman's been given three directions here where its cards are all supporting the deck archetypes really well. So yeah, this is a really good set for Shaman, and I think all these cards are going to see play. So yeah, Shaman's making a big wave now.